zero visibility, winds gusting at 60 knots, a Black Hawk helicopter screaming against the laws of physics, and inside, one woman who refused to leave 7 dying men behind. They told Lieutenant Preston Jenkins it was a suicide mission. They said the storm would swat her out of the sky before she ever saw the mountain peak. They were almost right. But what nobody expected was that the weather was the least of her problems, because up on that ridge, something far deadlier than the cold was waiting in the dark. This is the untold true story of the flight no one believed would ever return. The coffee in Lieutenant Preston Jenkins's styrofoam cup had gone cold 3 hours ago, a murky brown sludge that mirrored the sky outside the plexiglass window of the TOC, Tactical Operations Center. It was November in the Hindu Kush, a time of year when the mountains didn't just exist. They loomed, predatory and ancient, swallowing sound and light. Inside the base, the air was recycled and stale, smelling of CLP gun oil, sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of ozone from the server racks. Preston rubbed her eyes, feeling the grit of fatigue under her eyelids. She was a flight medic with the 101st Airborne, currently attached to a forward operating base that technically didn't exist on most maps. She'd been awake for 22 hours. "Jenkins, get some rack time," Captain Mike Rossi grunted, walking past her. Rossi was a pilot's pilot, 40, greying at the temples, with eyes that had seen too many tracers in the dark. "Nothing's flying in this soup. Meteorology says the ceiling is dropping to 0. It's a no-go for the next 12 hours. Preston looked up, her face pale under the harsh, fluorescent lights. "I have a feeling, Mike, the radio's been too quiet. That's called peace, Preston. Enjoy it." Rossi was wrong. It wasn't peace, it was the holding of breath. 10 minutes later, the radio crackled. It wasn't a standard transmission. It was a jagged, desperate burst of static that cut through the low hum of the operations center like a serrated knife. "Taking heavy, multiple casualties. Hammer 7 is down. I repeat, Hammer 7 is down. Need immediate medevac. Over." The room froze. The mundane clatter of keyboards stopped. Every head turned toward the radio operator, a young corporal named Halloway, whose face had just drained of all color. "Identify," the watch commander barked. "This is Viper 26. We are pinned. Grid reference. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. 7 critical. Bleeding out. We can't hold." The transmission cut out, swallowed by the hiss of the storm. "Viper 26, Rossi whispered, staring at the map on the wall. "That's Marine Recon, Sergeant Miller's team. They're up on Ridge 402. The watch commander slammed his hand on the table. "Ridge 402? That's 9,000 feet up. In this weather? You can't fly a kite up there, let alone a 60-sitter. Preston was already standing. She didn't remember standing up, but she was moving toward her locker, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump hitting her system. "We have to go," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. The commander turned to her, his expression hard. "Negative, Lieutenant. Look at the monitors. We have wind shear at 45 knots, gusting to 60. Visibility is less than 10 meters. If you go up there, you crash. Period." "If we don't go, 7 Marines die," Preston countered, her jaw set. "You heard him. Bleeding out. They don't have hours. They have minutes." "It's a suicide run, Preston," Rossi interjected, stepping between her and the door. "I've flown in hurricanes. I've flown with half a tail rotor. But that?" He gestured to the window, where the rain was now lashing sideways, turning to sleet. "That is a meat grinder. The downdrafts alone will smash us into the cliffside." Preston looked Rossi in the eye. They had flown 30 missions together. She knew about his ex-wife in Ohio, his daughter's soccer games, the nightmares he didn't tell the flight surgeon about. Mike, she said softly. Miller. Davidson. Kowalski. Those are the guys up there. If it was you on that ridge, bleeding into the mud, would you want me to sit here and drink coffee because the wind is blowing? Rossi stared at her. The muscle in his jaw worked. He looked at the commander, then back at Preston. He let out a long, shuddering breath and grabbed his helmet from the rack. God help me, Rossi muttered. I'm going to lose my wings for this, or my life. He turned to the commander. I'm volunteering. If the bird spins up, I'm flying it. The commander looked at them, the protocol manual screaming in his head against the reality of 7 dead Marines. He looked at the clock. I can't authorize this, the commander said, turning his back to them. But if a bird were to start up for a maintenance check and happen to depart, I wouldn't be able to stop it in time. It was the only permission they would get. Preston grabbed her med bag. It weighed 40 pounds, packed with tourniquets, morphine, plasma, and combat gauze. As she zipped her flight suit, she felt a cold pit in her stomach. This wasn't a mission. It was a gamble with the devil, and the house always won. The rotor wash on the tarmac was violent enough to knock a grown man over. The Black Hawk, tail number Super 64, rocked on its landing gear as the blade spun up. Cutting through the freezing sleet, Preston strapped herself into the back. Usually, she would have a crew chief and a door gunner. Today, they had left them behind. Weight was everything. Every pound they shed was a pound of lift they desperately needed to fight the downdrafts. It was just Rossi in the cockpit and Preston in the bay, surrounded by emptiness and the roar of the engines. Comms check, Rossi's voice crackled in her headset, tight and professional. Loud and clear, Preston replied. She checked her oxygen mask. At 9,000 feet, hypoxia was a silent killer. Hold on back there, Doc. We're leaving the wire. It's going to get bumpy. Bumpy was the understatement of the century. As soon as the wheels left the tarmac, the storm grabbed the helicopter like a terrier shaking a rat. The aircraft dropped 20 feet instantly, the stomach-churning sensation of freefall hitting Preston hard. Wind shear! Rossi yelled over the intercom. Hang on! The engine screamed, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in Preston's teeth. She gripped the nylon webbing of her seat, her knuckles white. Outside the small window, the world had disappeared. There was no ground, no sky, no horizon. Just a swirling vortex of grey fog and black rain. They were flying on instruments alone, IFR, instrument flight rules. But in mountains, instruments lay. The radar altimeter bounced wildly as the terrain beneath them jagged up and down. Passing 5,000 feet, Rossi called out. Icing on the windshield. Turning on de-icing. We're losing rotor efficiency. Preston looked at the temperature gauge in the rear cabin. It was plummeting. Ice was the enemy. If it built up on the rotor blades, it would destroy the aerodynamic lift. The helicopter would simply turn into a falling brick. Come on, baby. Hold together, Preston whispered, patting the metal wall of the fuselage. Suddenly, the helicopter banked hard right, slamming Preston against the restraint harness. A warning buzzer blared in the cockpit. The master caution alarm. What is it? Preston shouted. Downdraft! Huge one! We're dropping! They were falling at 2,000 feet per minute. The mountain face was somewhere in the dark ahead of them, invisible and deadly. Rossi pulled back on the cyclic, maximizing power, but the air was too thin, the wind too strong. Preston closed her eyes. This is it. This is how I die. Not in a firefight, but smashed against a rock in the dark. She thought of her brother, David, back in Texas. She thought of the unread letter in her locker. Then, she thought of the voice on the radio. Hammer 7 is down. No, she hissed. Not today. With a groan of metal, the Black Hawk leveled out. Rossi had managed to find a pocket of stable air. "That was too close," Rossi breathed, his voice trembling. "We're at 8,500 feet. We're nearing the grid. Doc, you need to be ready. I can't land this thing." Preston's heart skipped. "What?" "Look at the terrain data," Rossi shouted. "Ridge 402 is a knife edge. There's no flat ground. And with this wind, if I try to touch down, we'll roll over. I have to hover. You're going to have to hoist down." "In this wind?" Preston asked, incredulous. "I'll be a pendulum. It's the only way, or we turn back now." Preston looked at her med bag. She looked at the floor of the helicopter, where the hoist cable lay coiled. "Do it," she said. "Get us over the target. Viper 2-6, this is Dust-Off 1. Rossi broadcasted on the emergency frequency. "We are 1 minute out. Pop smoke if you have it. We can't see shit up here." Silence. "Viper 2-6, acknowledge." Nothing but static. "They might be dead, Mike," Preston said, the dread pooling in her stomach. "Or their radio is gone." "I see something," Rossi said suddenly. 2 o'clock low, a flare, it's barely visible. Preston strained to look out the window. Through the swirling snow, a faint, sputtering red glow appeared. It was the universal signal for distress and enemy location. Red smoke usually meant enemy near. Green was safe. "They popped red smoke, Mike," Preston warned. "That means the LZ is hot." "Or it's all they had left," Rossi argued. "I'm coming into a hover, 9,000 feet. Winds are, Jesus, 40 knots from the north." The helicopter shuddered violently as it slowed. The side door was open, and the freezing gale blasted into the cabin, instantly numbing Preston's exposed skin. She hooked the carabiner of the hoist to her vest. She was about to dangle on a thin steel cable, suspended over a black abyss in a storm, dropping into a potential ambush. "I'm holding steady!" Rossi yelled. "Go! Go! Go!" Preston pushed herself out of the helicopter. The wind hit her like a physical blow. She spun wildly, the cable twisting. Below her, the red flare sputtered, casting long, demonic shadows against the rocks. As she descended, the snow whipped her face, blinding her. 30 feet, 20 feet. Then, the darkness below her lit up. Not with a flare, with muzzle flashes. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets whizzed past her, snapping the air. One pinged off the helicopter's underbelly above her. "Taking fire!" Rossi screamed. "They're using the flare as bait! It's an ambush!" "Don't pull me up!" Preston screamed into her mic. "I see them! I see the Marines!" Below, huddled in a small depression in the rock, she saw the shapes of men. They weren't firing at her. They were firing outward, defending their position. The muzzle flashes she saw were coming from the ridge above them. Drop me now." "Preston, I can't hold this." She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. She unclipped the carabiner with shaking hands. "I'm down! Pull the cable! Get out of here, Mike! Circle out of range! I'm not leaving you! You're a giant target! Go!" The Black Hawk roared, banking away into the clouds, leaving Preston alone on the freezing mountain. The silence of the cockpit was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of wind and the terrifying staccato of AK-47 fire echoing off the canyon walls. She dragged her bag toward the depression in the rocks. A hand reached out and grabbed her vest, pulling her into the cover. It was a Marine, his face smeared with blood and camouflage paint. It was Sergeant Miller. He looked at her with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted over the wind. "I'm your ride," Preston yelled back, checking him for wounds. "Where are the casualties?" Miller pointed to the back of the small cave-like overhang. "Everywhere. We have 7, 3 critical. Davidson took a round to the neck. We thought you were a gunship. We didn't think anyone was crazy enough to send a medic." Preston looked at the huddled forms. They were in bad shape. The snow around them was stained pink. "Nobody is," Preston muttered to herself as she cracked a glow stick. Just me. She crawled toward the first casualty. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a siege, and she was the only thing keeping these men from bleeding out before the Taliban, or the cold, finished them off. The depression in the rock was barely big enough for 4 men, let alone 8. It was less a cave and more a shallow overhang formed by tectonic violence millennia ago. It offered some protection from the wind, but almost none from the cold. Preston crawled deeper into the overhang, dragging her bag over the frozen scree. The air was thin at 9,000 feet, leaving her gasping. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. "Sit rep, Sergeant," she barked, her voice shaking from adrenaline and the biting cold. She cracked 3 more chem lights, bathing the gruesome scene in a sickly green glow. Sergeant Miller, the team leader, was propped against the rock wall. His left leg was a mess of shredded uniform and blood-soaked bandages. He was pale, his teeth chattering violently, but he still held his M4 rifle, scanning the darkness outside. "We got hit. Ambush on patrol," Miller spat out between chattering teeth. "Taliban dig-in sites up on the ridge lines. They waited until the storm hit to pin us down. We have 3 walking wounded, 4 critical. We're down to 2 mags per man. No grenades left." "Where's the worst one?" Miller nodded toward a huddled form in the corner, tended to by another Marine who was using his own body heat to keep the casualty warm. "Davidson, neck wound. He's drowning in his own blood, Doc." Preston moved quickly. The Marine tending to Davidson was Private First Class Kowalski, a kid barely 20 years old. His eyes were wide with terror in the green light. "Move, Kowalski," Preston commanded, gently but firmly pushing him aside. Corporal Davidson was grey. His lips were blue. A thick, improvised dressing was wrapped around his neck, saturated with bright red arterial blood. His breathing was ragged, a wet, gurgling sound that sent a chill deeper than the snow down Preston's spine. He was aspirating blood. "Hey, Davidson, stay with me," Preston said, her hands moving automatically. She pulled off her thick gloves, needing the dexterity of her fingers. The cold hit her skin like a hammer. Within seconds, her fingertips were numb. "Kowalski, hold this light steady. Miller, I need security. Don't let them get close." Crack! A bullet slammed into the rock inches from Preston's head, spraying razor-sharp stone shards across her face. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Outside, the Taliban fighters were probing. They knew the Americans were wounded. They knew the helicopter had abandoned them. They were moving down the slopes, using the howling wind to mask the sound of their approach. Miller returned fire, his brass casings tinkling against the frozen ground. "They're getting brave, Doc! How long?" "As long as it takes," Preston yelled back. She carefully peeled back the blood-soaked bandage on Davidson's neck. It was bad. A 7.262 bit round had grazed the carotid artery and torn through the soft tissue of the pharynx. Every time he tried to inhale, blood was sucked into his windpipe instead of air. "He's occluding," Preston muttered. She grabbed a suction catheter from her bag, but the battery pack was dead, frozen by the extreme cold. Damn it! She tried to use a manual pump, but the blood was freezing in the tubes. Davidson's eyes rolled back in his head. He started to seize, his body arching off the frozen ground as his brain screamed for oxygen. "Doc, he's dying!" Kowalski screamed. "Shut up, I'm working!" Preston barked. She knew what she had to do. It was a procedure they trained for in sterile classrooms on plastic dummies. Doing it here, in the dark, freezing cold, under fire, on a dying friend, was insanity. "Miller, give me your knife," Preston demanded. "What? Your knife? Now!" Miller threw her his combat knife. She didn't need it for cutting. She needed it to cut the clothes away from Davidson's throat faster than her medical shears could manage. She ripped open an alcohol swab packet with her teeth, her lips already cracked and bleeding from the cold. She hastily wiped the skin over Davidson's trachea, below the massive wound. It was a joke of sterilization in this filth, but it was protocol. She grabbed her scalpel. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably from the hypothermia setting in. She had to center herself. Focus, Jenkins. It's just plumbing. Air goes in, air goes out. Right now, the pipe is blocked. Bypass the block. She looked at Kowalski, whose face was inches from hers, holding the green glow stick. "Kowalski, look at me," she commanded. He looked up, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Do not drop that light. If you drop it, he dies. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically. "Yes, ma'am." Preston took a deep breath, placed the tip of the scalpel against the skin over Davidson's cricothyroid membrane, the soft spot in the throat, and pressed down. Skin is tougher than people think. It resists being cut. Preston had to push hard, slicing down through the dermis, then the subcutaneous fat. Blood welled up instantly, warm and blinding, freezing almost as soon as it hit the air. Davidson jerked. He was unconscious, but his body registered the assault. "Hold him down!" Preston yelled. Kowalski leaned his weight onto Davidson's chest. Outside, another burst of machine gun fire raked the overhang. A ricochet struck the Marine next to Miller in the shoulder. He grunted and fell back. "Man down! Johnson is hit!" Miller yelled, firing a long burst in return. Preston couldn't look away. Her world had shrunk to a 2-inch square of bloody flesh on Davidson's throat. She reached the membrane. She could feel the rigid cartilage of the trachea underneath. This was the moment of truth. If she cut too high, she'd hit the vocal cords. Too low, the thyroid gland, causing massive bleeding she couldn't stop. Too deep, she'd puncture the esophagus behind the windpipe. She sliced horizontally. A hiss of air escaped the incision, spraying a fine mist of blood into her face. Got it. But the opening was too small. The tissue was swelling rapidly from the trauma and the cold. She needed to keep it open. She jammed the handle of the scalpel into the incision and twisted it 90 degrees, widening the hole. Davidson gasped, a ragged, terrible sound, but it was air moving into lungs. "Hand me the tube, the crick tube," she yelled at Kowalski, gesturing with her head toward the open med bag. Kowalski fumbled with freezing fingers, grabbing the plastic cricothyrotomy tube. He handed it to her. Preston guided the tube into the bloody slit in Davidson's throat. She pushed it down until the flange rested against his skin. She pulled the stylet out. Davidson took a breath. Then another. His chest rose visibly. The terrible gurgling sound stopped. The blue tint began to fade from his lips, replaced by the pallor of severe shock. But he was alive. Preston quickly inflated the small cuff on the tube to seal the airway, so no more blood could drain down, then secured the apparatus around his neck with the Velcro strap. She sat back on her heels, gasping for air herself. Her hands were covered in congealed blood. She was shaking so hard her teeth felt loose. She looked up. The gunfire outside had momentarily paused. The Marines in the overhang were all staring at her. Even Miller had stopped scanning the horizon for a second. They were looking at the tube sticking out of their friend's neck, then at the woman who had just cut his throat open to save him. The skepticism, the "what is a female medic doing here?" look that she was so used to seeing, was gone, replaced by raw, terrifying respect. "Is he? Did you do it?" Kowalski whispered. "He's breathing," Preston said, her voice rough. "But he's lost a lot of blood. He's hypothermic. They all are. If we don't get out of here in the next hour, the cold will finish what the Taliban started." She didn't have time to rest. She crawled over to Johnson, The Marine just hit in the shoulder. It was a through and through, painful, but not immediately life-threatening. She packed it with combat gauze and wrapped it tight. Then she moved to the others, checking tourniquets, administering morphine syrettes that she had to warm in her armpits first, covering them with the few precious space blankets she had brought. She was running on fumes. The adrenaline crash was looming. She checked her own body. She couldn't feel her feet. Frostbite was setting in. She crawled back to Miller. "Sergeant, we need that bird back," she said. Miller looked at her, his face grim. "I tried the radio, Doc. It's dead. Battery frozen or antenna shot off. We have no comms with base, no comms with the bird." Preston stared at him. The implications hit her hard. They were cut off. Rossi thought they were overrun. He wouldn't come back if he thought they were all dead. He couldn't risk the aircraft for corpses. "We have to signal him," Preston said. "We have to let him know we're alive." "With what?" "We used the last flare. We have no smoke left." Preston looked around the desperate little cave. Her eyes landed on the stack of empty ammunition crates and the heavy thermal ponchos the Marines were wearing. "Fire," Preston said. Miller shook his head. "Doc, everything is wet. It's 10 degrees below zero. You can't start a fire here." "We have to," Preston insisted, grabbing an empty wooden ammo crate. She started smashing it against the rock, splintering the wood. "We use the propellant from the extra rifle rounds to start it. We burn the wood. We burn the plastic MRE wrappers. Anything that will make light. It will draw every fighter on this mountain right to us," Miller argued. "They already know we're here, Sergeant. They're just waiting for us to freeze to death so they can save their ammo. If we don't signal Rossi, we die anyway. At least this way we die fighting for a ride home." Miller stared at her for a long beat. He looked at his exhausted, freezing men. He looked at Davidson, barely clinging to life with a tube in his neck. He nodded slowly. "All right, Marines," Miller growled, his voice regaining some of its command structure. "You heard the doc. Strip the powder from your spare rounds. Stack the wood. We're lighting a beacon." The plan was madness, to light a fire in a blizzard, using wet wood and gunpowder, while surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 10 to 1. "Pull the bullets," Preston ordered, her voice rasping. She handed her own sidearm magazine to Kowalski. "Twist the slug out. Dump the powder on the wood." The Marines moved with agonizing slowness. Their hands were frozen claws. Private Johnson, despite his shoulder wound, was using his teeth to rip the bullets from their casings, spitting the copper slugs onto the icy floor. They created a small pyramid of splintered ammo crates, MRE wrappers, and the precious grey powder. "They're moving up," Miller hissed from the edge of the overhang. "I can hear them. They're crunching the snow." The wind had shifted. It was blowing the sound of the enemy's approach straight into the cave. It wasn't just a few scouts anymore. It was a platoon-sized element, moving to finish the job. "We need that light now," Miller yelled. Preston knelt by the pile. She took a magnesium fire starter, a small block of metal with a striker, from her survival vest. Matches were useless in this wind. Lighters wouldn't spark at this altitude. She struck the flint. A shower of sparks died instantly in the gale. "Come on," she begged. She struck it again. Nothing. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Bullets began to chew up the rock face around them. The Taliban had stopped being subtle. They were suppressing the cave, pinning the Americans down while their assault team moved in for the kill. "Contact front!" Miller screamed, opening fire. "Kowalski, get on the saw! Squad automatic weapon!" Kowalski grabbed the heavy machine gun, but his frozen fingers fumbled the belt. "Let me," Preston said, shoving him aside. She wasn't an infantryman, but every soldier is a rifleman first. She slammed the feed tray cover down and racked the bolt. She pointed the barrel toward the muzzle flashes in the darkness and squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked against her shoulder, the loud chug-chug-chug providing a brief morale boost. But she was a medic. She needed to be lighting the fire, not shooting. "Kowalski, light the damn fire!" she screamed over the noise. "I can't get a spark." Preston abandoned the gun, crawling back to the wood pile. "Shield me, everyone, form a wall." The walking wounded huddled around the small pile of trash, using their bodies to block the wind. Preston struck the flint again. Spark. Spark. Flash. The gunpowder ignited with a violent whoosh, a blinding white flare that momentarily illuminated the terror on every man's face. The flame licked up, grabbing onto the plastic wrappers, then the dry inner splinters of the wood. "Feed it!" Preston yelled. "Don't let it die!" They threw everything they had on it. Maps, extra socks, the pages of a code book. The fire grew, a flickering orange tongue defying the storm. But the light did exactly what Miller had feared. It turned the cave into a stage. An RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, screeched out of the darkness. It slammed into the rock face 10 feet above them. The explosion was deafening, collapsing part of the overhang. Dust and rock rained down, nearly smothering the fire. Preston was thrown back against the wall, her ears ringing. She shook her head, trying to clear the concussion. "They're rushing us," Miller shouted. "Fix bayonets! Prepare for close quarters!" It was the order no one ever wants to hear. It meant they were out of ammo. It meant the end was measured in seconds. Preston looked at Davidson, still unconscious with the tube in his throat. She looked at the fire, now struggling against the snow. She grabbed her M4, checked the magazine. 3 rounds left. She stood up next to Miller. "You should have stayed in the bird, Doc," Miller said, sighting down his rifle. "And missed all this fun?" Preston replied, her voice steady. They aimed into the dark, waiting for the shadows to take shape, waiting to die. Captain Mike Rossi was staring at his fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above the red reserve line. He was flying in broad circles 5 miles out, dipping in and out of the cloud layer. He had been gone for 40 minutes. The logical, military part of his brain, the part trained by 20 years of army doctrine, told him to turn back. "They are dead," the voice in his head said. "No one survives a hot LZ with critical casualties in sub-zero temp for this long. If you go back, you lose the crew and the bird." But the other part of his brain, the part that had looked Preston Jenkins in the eye before they left, refused to turn the cyclic stick toward home. "Talk to me, Mike," he whispered to himself. "Give me a sign." He banked the Black Hawk hard to the left, fighting the crosswind. The storm was intensifying. The snow was horizontal now. Then he saw it. It was faint, barely a pixel of light in the sea of black and grey. A flicker. It wasn't the steady electric glow of a flashlight. It wasn't the chemical burn of a flare. It was orange, erratic. It was a campfire. "You crazy son of a..." Rossi grinned, tears pricking his eyes. They built a fire. He keyed his internal mic, even though he was alone. "Hang on, Preston. Daddy's coming home." He pushed the collective down, dropping the helicopter like a stone. He wasn't going to approach cautiously this time. He was going to fly aggressive. He was going to fly angry. He armed the helicopter's countermeasures, though they wouldn't stop bullets. He switched on the external landing lights, usually a death sentence in combat. But he needed to see the ground, and he needed to blind the enemy. The Black Hawk roared toward Ridge 402 at 140 knots, skimming just feet above the jagged peaks. Down in the cave, the situation was critical. 2 Taliban fighters had made it to the ledge. Miller had dropped one with his last bullet. The second one was charging Kowalski with a knife. Preston swung her rifle, but before she could fire, a wall of noise descended from the heavens. A blinding white light flooded the ledge, brighter than the sun. The wind from the rotors hit with the force of a hurricane, blasting the snow and the enemy fighters backward. The Black Hawk hung there, defied gravity, its nose pointed down, its wheels inches from the precipice. It was flying so aggressively that the rotor tips were screaming. "Load up! Load up now!" Preston screamed, grabbing Davidson's drag handle. The Taliban fighter who had been charging Kowalski was now cowering, blinded by the spotlight and deafened by the engines. Miller didn't hesitate. He used the butt of his rifle to knock the man off the ledge. "Go! Go!" It was chaos. The helicopter couldn't land. The ground was too uneven. Rossi was holding a one-wheel hover, balancing the right main gear on a rock the size of a dinner table, while the rest of the helicopter hung over a 1,000-foot drop. Preston and Kowalski dragged Davidson to the open door. The wash from the rotors was freezing the sweat on their faces instantly. They heaved the unconscious Marine onto the floor of the cabin. "Get the walking wounded!" Preston yelled. One by one, the battered Marines scrambled into the bay. Miller was the last. He grabbed Preston's vest and threw her in, then dove in after her. "We're all in!" Preston screamed into her headset, plugging back into the aircraft's intercom. "Go, Mike, go!" Rossi didn't wait for permission. He pulled the collective up with all his strength. The engines groaned, temperature gauges spiking into the red as they fought to lift the overloaded bird at this altitude. The helicopter lurched upward just as the Taliban machine guns found their range again. Ping, 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 thud. Bullets walked up the fuselage. One shattered the plexiglass chin bubble by Rossi's feet. Another punched through the rear cabin, missing Preston's head by inches and burying itself in the transmission housing. "We're taking hits!" Rossi yelled. "Hydraulic pressure fluctuating!" "Just get us off this rock!" Preston shouted back, already checking Davidson's pulse. Rossi banked the helicopter violently to the right, using the mountain's gravity to gain speed. They dropped off the cliff face, plummeting into the dark valley below to escape the gunfire. The stomach-churning freefall lasted for 10 seconds before Rossi leveled them out. They were away. Preston slumped against the bulkhead. She looked around the cabin. It was packed with frozen, bleeding, exhausted men. But as she counted heads, her heart stopped. 7 Marines, 1 pilot, 1 medic, everyone was there. She looked at Davidson. His chest was rising and falling rhythmically through the tube in his neck. She looked at Miller. The hardened recon Marine was staring at her. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. "Dust off 1 to base." Rossi's voice came over the radio, cracking with emotion. The radio operator at the TOC, who had been listening to static for an hour, responded instantly. "Base hears you, Dust off 1. Go ahead." "Inbound with 7 packs," Rossi said. "All souls on board. Estimated time of arrival, 20 mics. Have the whiskey ready." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of cheering so loud it distorted the transmission. Preston closed her eyes. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. She felt the vibration of the helicopter, the most beautiful feeling in the world. But the story wasn't over. As they approached the base lights, the master caution warning light flashed on the dashboard again. "Preston," Rossi said, his voice deadly calm. "Don't panic, but that last round hit the tail rotor drive shaft. We're losing your control." Preston's eyes snapped open. The helicopter began to spin slowly to the left. "Brace for impact." The laws of aerodynamics are unforgiving. A helicopter is a machine that beats the air into submission, a chaotic assembly of thousands of moving parts flying in close formation. When the tail rotor drive shaft sheared, severed by the lucky shot of a lone gunman on a ridge thousands of feet above, the Super 64 ceased to be a flying machine. It became a 6-ton pendulum swinging in the grip of gravity. "We're losing it. I have no yaw control." Rossi's voice was a strangled cry over the intercom, fighting the G-forces that were already pinning them to the walls. The world outside the plexiglass windows dissolved. The runway lights, which moments ago had been a welcoming beacon of safety, smeared into a kaleidoscope of dizzying streaks. The fuselage began to whip around the axis of the main rotor, spinning violently to the left. Inside the cabin, the sensation was sickening. It wasn't just a spin, it was a physical assault. The centrifugal force slammed Preston Jenkins against the bulkhead, the metal digging into her spine. Her helmet banged against the airframe. The loose equipment, medical bags, empty ammo casings, the unclipped carabiner of the hoist, became lethal projectiles, clattering around the metal interior like rocks in a dryer. "Power off! Entering auto-rotation!" Rossi screamed. It was a desperate Hail Mary maneuver. By cutting the engines, Rossi was removing the torque that was causing the spin. But he was also removing the power that kept them in the sky. The violent spinning slowed, replaced by the terrifying, stomach-churning sensation of falling. The engines wound down, the high-pitched whine replaced by the ominous, thumping whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the rotor blades, fighting to catch the air on the way down. They were falling like a stone, the ground rushing up to meet them at terminal velocity. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Preston shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat. She didn't curl into a ball to protect herself. Instinct overtook protocol. She threw her body across the stretcher where Corporal Davidson lay. He was strapped down, helpless, his neck wound fragile. If his head whipped forward on impact, the tube in his throat could tear loose, and he would drown in his own blood in seconds. She locked her arms around the frame of the litter, burying her face in his chest rig, becoming a human shield. "Feet flat! Knees locked!" Miller roared to his men, his voice barely audible over the wind rushing through the shattered chin bubble. Rossi waited until the last possible second. The dead man's curve. At 50 feet above the concrete, he hauled back on the cyclic stick and pulled the collective lever up into his armpit, using the remaining kinetic energy in the spinning blades to cushion the fall. The nose of the Black Hawk flared up violently, the tail boom swinging low. Crunch! The tail wheel struck the tarmac first. The sound was not a thud, but a sickening snap of structural metal giving way. The force of the impact jarred Preston's teeth, a shockwave that traveled up from the floor and rattled her skull. But they were still moving too fast. The helicopter slammed down onto its main landing gear. The struts, designed to absorb a hard landing, collapsed instantly under the excessive G-force. The belly of the aircraft smashed into the runway with the sound of a bomb going off. Sparks, thousands of them, a cascading shower of burning gold, erupted outside the windows as the aluminum skin ground against the asphalt. The helicopter tipped onto its right side, the momentum carrying it forward in a screeching, grinding slide. Wham! 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 The main rotor blades, still spinning, struck the ground. They didn't just break, they disintegrated. Shrapnel the size of machetes exploded outward, slicing through the air. One blade tip tore through the upper fuselage, ripping the metal roof open like a sardine can, showering the interior with insulation and hydraulic fluid. The slide seemed to last for an eternity. Preston felt the heat of friction radiating through the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, holding on to Davidson, waiting for the fireball, waiting for the end. And then, motion stopped. The screeching metal fell silent. The wind died. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of fluids and the groaning of twisted aluminum settling into its new shape. Preston gasped, inhaling a lungful of dust and the acrid, biting scent of pulverized fiberglass. She opened her eyes. The emergency lights flickered, bathing the wreckage in a hellish, intermittent red strobe. The world was tilted at a 45-degree angle. "Sound off! Miller's voice croaked from the darkness near the tail. "Who's alive?" "I'm good." A groan. "Legs stuck. But I'm here." "Clear!" Preston scrambled up from Davidson's chest. Her flight suit was soaked in warm liquid. For a terrifying second, she thought it was blood, but the pungent chemical smell told her it was hydraulic fluid. She checked Davidson. The tube was still in place. His pulse was thready, but he was there. "Fire!" Kowalski yelled, panic spiking in his voice. "I see fire! Portside engine!" Preston looked up through the shattered roof. A flicker of orange was licking at the engine cowling. The fuel tanks were ruptured. They were sitting inside a potential bomb. "Everyone out! Now! Move, move, move!" Preston commanded, her voice snapping with authority, despite the ringing in her ears. She scrambled toward the right side cargo door, but the impact had warped the frame. It was jammed shut. She kicked it, screaming in frustration, but the heavy metal wouldn't budge. "The window!" Miller shouted. "Go through the window!" Kowalski was already there, using the heavy barrel of his squad automatic weapon as a battering ram. He smashed the remaining plexiglass, clearing the jagged shards with his gloved hands. He tumbled out onto the tarmac, then turned back, reaching in. "Pass them to me." It was a nightmare of physics and adrenaline. The cabin was slick with oil and blood. The floor was now a wall. The Marines, battered, exhausted, and wounded, had to be hoisted up to the window. Preston grabbed Private Johnson, whose shoulder was bandaged. "Step on the seat. Go!" She shoved him upward. Kowalski grabbed his vest and hauled him through. One by one, they cleared the wreck. The fire was growing. The orange flicker had become a steady roar, and the heat was beginning to bake the interior of the cabin. Smoke, thick and black, began to pool in the ceiling, choking them. "Rossi!" Preston yelled, turning toward the cockpit. The pilot was slumped over the cyclic. The instrument panel had been crushed inward. Preston scrambled up the tilted floor, slipping on the hydraulic fluid. "Mike! Mike!" She grabbed his shoulder. Rossi groaned, his head lolling back. Blood was streaming from a cut above his eye, masking half his face. "Stuck," he wheezed. "Pedals crushed my ankle." Preston looked down. The nose of the helicopter had caved in. Rossi's boots were pinned under the twisted metal of the rudder pedals. "Miller, get up here!" Preston screamed. Miller limped forward, his face a mask of grim determination. He grabbed Rossi's vest. Preston grabbed his belt. "On 3, 1, 2, pull!" They heaved. Rossi screamed in agony as his broken ankle was wrenched free from the wreckage. They dragged him backward into the cargo bay. "Get him out," Preston ordered. Miller and another Marine hoisted the semi-conscious pilot up to the window where Kowalski was waiting. Now it was just Preston and Davidson, the unconscious man on the stretcher. The heat was intense now. The paint on the interior walls was bubbling. The smell of burning jet fuel, JP-8, was overwhelming, a thick, oily stench that coated the throat. "Doc, get out! She's gonna blow!" Kowalski screamed from outside. "Not without him!" Preston yelled back. She couldn't lift the stretcher alone. The angle was too steep. She unbuckled Davidson from the litter. He was dead weight, limp and heavy. She grabbed him by the drag handle on the back of his vest. She dug her boots into a seat frame, gritting her teeth so hard she felt a molar crack. "Help me!" she screamed at the window. Miller's upper body appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the flashing red lights of the approaching fire trucks. He reached down, his arms straining. Preston pushed Davidson upward with every ounce of strength she had left in her body. Her muscles burned. Her lungs screamed for air that wasn't filled with smoke. Miller grabbed Davidson's collar. Kowalski grabbed his belt. They hauled the unconscious Marine up and over the lip of the window, his boots disappearing into the night. Preston was alone. The fire roared, a sudden whoosh of ignition as the fuel fumes caught. A wall of flame rolled across the ceiling of the cabin. She didn't think. She launched herself at the window. Hands grabbed her flight suit. Miller, Kowalski, maybe God himself, and yanked her through the jagged opening. She hit the cold, wet tarmac, hard, rolling over her shoulder. "Run! Drag them! Go! Go!" They scrambled away, dragging the wounded, slipping on the wet runway. They were barely 30 yards away when the fuel tanks finally let go. Boom! The explosion was a physical blow. A massive fireball mushroomed into the night sky, turning the darkness into noon. The heat wave washed over them, singing the hair on their arms. The shockwave knocked Preston flat onto her stomach. She covered her head, debris raining down around them, bits of burning plastic, metal, and rubber. Then the sound of sirens drowned out the roar of the fire. Massive yellow crash fire rescue trucks screeched to a halt, forming a wall between the survivors and the inferno. The roof turrets spun, unleashing massive streams of white foam onto the burning skeleton of the Super 64, suffocating the fire. Preston lay on the asphalt. The rain was falling harder now, cold and clean, washing the soot from her face. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the chaotic sky. Her chest was heaving. She checked her hands. They were shaking so violently she couldn't make a fist. A firefighter in silver proximity gear ran up to her, his face masked. He knelt down, shouting something, but Preston couldn't hear him. Her hearing was gone, replaced by a high-pitched tinnitus whine. She pushed his hand away and sat up. She needed to count. She looked to her left. Rossi was lying on a backboard, medics already cutting away his flight suit to check his leg. He was awake, grimacing, but alive. She looked to her right. The Marines. Miller was sitting on the ground, his head between his knees, vomiting from the adrenaline dump and the concussion. Johnson was leaning against a truck tire, holding his shoulder. Kowalski was staring at the fire, his face blank with shock, and Davidson. Medics were swarming Davidson. One of them looked up, saw Preston watching, and gave a sharp nod. He pointed to the oxygen mask they were placing over the face of the man whose throat she had cut open. The chest rose, the chest fell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, plus Rossi, plus herself. Preston felt a bubble of pressure rising in her chest. It started as a sob, a ragged, painful convulsion of her diaphragm. But as it came out, it twisted into a laugh. It was a manic, hysterical sound, frightening in its intensity. She laughed until tears streamed down her soot-stained cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the grime. She collapsed back onto the tarmac, spreading her arms wide, feeling the hard, beautiful, solid earth beneath her. It wasn't moving. It wasn't spinning. It was solid. Miller crawled over to her. He didn't look like the hardened recon Marine anymore. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He sat down next to her in the rain, indifferent to the chaos of the firefighters and the medics around them. He reached out a hand, his knuckles bloody and raw. "Doc," he rasped. Preston took his hand. She squeezed it, feeling the warmth of another living human being. "We're here, Miller," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're all here." The storm clouds above finally began to break, revealing a single, solitary star shining in the gap. It was indifferent to their struggle, cold and distant. But down here, on the wet runway, amidst the smell of burnt fuel and the flashing lights of salvation, there was life. Against all odds, against the storm, against the enemy, and against death itself, there was life. The hospital tent was warm. It smelled of antiseptic and strong coffee. It had been 12 hours since the crash. Preston was sitting on the edge of a cot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands were bandaged where the frostbite had nipped her fingers. The door flap opened. The base commander walked in. The same man who had told her it was a suicide mission. The same man who had refused to authorize the flight. He stopped in front of her. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just looked at her, then at Rossi, who was sitting in a wheelchair nearby with a broken ankle. "I have the flight logs," the commander said quietly. "Technically, that bird never left the ground. Technically, this never happened." Preston looked up, her eyes tired. "Sir?" "Because if it happened," the commander continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, "I'd have to court-martial you both for disobeying a direct order and destroying a $20 million aircraft." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "However," he said, his voice thickening with emotion, "I just got off the secure line with the Marine Commandant. He wanted to know how 7 of his best men survived an ambush on Ridge 402 when they were listed as MIA." The commander tossed the paper onto Preston's lap. It was a list of names, the 7 Marines. Next to each name was a status. Stable. "You didn't just save 7 men, Lieutenant," the commander said. "You saved 7 families. You saved 7 futures." He stood at attention and saluted. It wasn't a perfunctory officer's salute. It was slow, crisp, and held for a long count. Dismissed. Heroes. 3 months later, the ceremony was held at Fort Campbell. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the opposite of that night in the Hindu Kush. Sergeant Miller was there, leaning on a cane. Davidson was there, a thick scar running across his throat, his voice a raspy whisper. But he was alive to whisper it. When they called Preston's name, the applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. The Marines of Viper 26 stood up. Then the pilots stood up. Then the generals. She stood on the podium as the Silver Star was pinned to her chest, the 3rd highest military combat decoration, and rare for a woman to receive for valor in combat. But she didn't look at the medal. She looked at the front row. Davidson was holding a little girl, maybe 3 years old, his daughter. She was waving a small American flag. Preston felt tears prick her eyes. That was the mission, not the medal, not the glory. The mission was the little girl who still had a father, because a stubborn nurse and a crazy pilot refused to listen to the storm. Miller walked up to her afterwards, shaking her hand with a grip like iron. "They told us no one was coming," Miller said softly. Preston smiled, gripping his hand back. "They were wrong." "Yeah," Miller grinned. "They usually are. You're one of us now, Doc. Semper Fi." "Semper Fi," Preston replied. She looked up at the sky. A black hawk was flying overhead, its rotors beating the air. She didn't feel fear anymore. She just felt proud. She was a medic, and she would fly into hell again tomorrow if someone needed her. Preston Jenkins and Mike Rossi broke every rule in the book that night. They defied their commanding officer, they defied the weather, and they defied the odds. But because they did, 7 men came home who were destined to die on that mountain. This story reminds us that sometimes the difference between life and death isn't policy or equipment. It's the sheer refusal of one person to give up on another. It's about the promise that says, "I will come for you." If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps get these heroes' stories out to more people. And if you want more incredible true stories of survival and valor, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. What would you have done in Preston's shoes? Would you have boarded that helicopter? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.